Hey everybody, welcome to part 3 of this week's material. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is how federalism is embodied in the Constitution. So remember, federalism is a system in which power is shared between a large central government and smaller units of government. So number one, federalism is expressed in the Constitution by expressly giving certain powers to the federal government. These are called federal powers. So, for example, a federal power is the power to negotiate treaties. States don't have that power. Governors of states don't have the constitutional authority to negotiate treaties with other countries. That's a federal power, a power that is specifically delegated to the federal government. A second way that federalism is embodied in the Constitution is by expressly giving certain powers to states. These are called state powers. An example of a state power is the power to run federal elections. That's a power that's specifically given to the states. It's also one of the reasons that we had, as a country, so many issues during the Jim Crow era with states creating certain laws to specifically prevent African American voters from being able to vote. Laws like IQ tests, like poll taxes, were instituted by the states specifically to prevent African Americans from voting. And the reason that they could do that is because the Constitution specifically gives that power to run federal elections to the states. The third way that federalism is expressed in the Constitution is by creating a space in which both the federal government and the states share the same power. We just talked about this a moment ago. Those are called concurrent powers. The example that we gave is the power to tax. Both the states and the federal government concurrently have the power to tax. A fourth way that federalism is embodied in the Constitution is by giving the states a role in amending the Constitution itself. So to amend the Constitution means to change something about the Constitution. So in order to amend the Constitution, 3/4 of the states are required to agree that they want to amend the Constitution. And remember, if the idea of federalism is to share power between the federal level and the states, then it makes sense that this power to amend the Constitution is shared with the states. A fifth way that federalism is embodied in the Constitution is by including a clause. Remember, a clause is simply a group of words. These next 3 things that we talk about all deal with clauses. So another way that federalism is embodied in the Constitution is by including what is called the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause is an incredibly important part of the Constitution. What it basically says is that the Constitution, any federal laws that are made, and any treaties, those are legal agreements between the United States and another country, any treaties that are made are all the supreme law of the land. This is why federal law has more power and more weight than state laws. So, for example, if the federal government makes a law saying that it's illegal to own assault rifles or certain types of guns, then no states can say, well, we will allow assault rifles. So in other words, the federal law always supersedes or always has more weight, more power than state laws do. So I'm going to go on a little sidebar here, because usually in my in-person class, someone will raise their hand and say, "Excuse me, Professor Godfrey, but what about marijuana laws?" Because for those of you who aren't aware, there is a federal law that outlaws the sale of marijuana, yet many states have legalized the use of medical marijuana. And then there are a couple of states, Washington and Colorado to be specific, that have legalized the recreational use of marijuana. Now, the reason that this is possible is because the federal government has said under the Obama administration that it is not going to enforce federal marijuana laws. So that opened the door for the states to make their own laws. However, you should understand that the next president of the United States will have the power, if he or she chooses, to execute federal marijuana law and shut down legalized recreational marijuana in Washington, Colorado, and medical marijuana all throughout the United States. If the next president chooses to do that, they will have the power to do that because of the Supremacy Clause. Honestly, it's unlikely that the next president would do that, but it could happen, and that's because of the Supremacy Clause. A next area that federalism is expressed in the Constitution, which we talked about in this last clip, is by including what is called the Reservation Clause. Remember, the Reservation Clause is how states get their powers, because in the 10th Amendment, we said, it states that any powers that aren't specifically granted only to the federal government or prevented by the Constitution are reserved for the states. So by including the Reservation Clause, our Constitution embodies federalism. And then finally, by including what is called the Full Faith and Credit Clause. Here's one that we did not discuss. The Full Faith and Credit Clause is how the relationship between states and other states is regulated by the Constitution. So what the Full Faith and Credit Clause says is that states are supposed to give full faith and credit to the judicial decisions in other states and the licenses of other states. So this is why you can drive your car, if you have a car, from California into Nevada without having to get a new driver's license, because the state of Nevada recognizes the driver's licenses of the state of California. It also means that if you are convicted of a crime in the state of California, say murder, you can't flee to Nevada and claim asylum and say, I shouldn't be returned to California. If you've been convicted of a crime in one state, that conviction stands in other states as well, and you will be arrested and returned to the other state. So these are all ways in which federalism, remember that's the sharing of power between a large government and smaller units of government, that's how federalism is embodied in our Constitution. And have a lovely rest of your evening or day. Bye.